What does a town do with a single missing shoe? In Millbrook Falls, New Hampshire, that is all the search parties found for 28 years. One small sneaker, laces still tied, sitting at the edge of the county fairground, where an 8-year-old girl named Katie Sorensen was last seen reaching for a balloon. It was October of 1996. The last warm Saturday of the season, the annual harvest fair that half the town had attended for generations. Katie was there with her mother, 30 feet away at most, for less than 4 minutes. When her mother turned back around, Katie was gone, and the shoe was the only thing anyone would find of her for nearly 3 decades. Hundreds of people were at that fair. Neighbors, teachers, family friends. People who had known Katie since she was born. Not one of them saw anything worth reporting. Not one of them could say, with any certainty, who the small girl by the balloon line had walked away with. For 28 years, the answer to what happened to Katie Sorensen sat somewhere in that same town, hiding in plain sight behind an unremarkable face nobody thought to question. What finally broke the silence wasn't a confession, and it wasn't new evidence pulled from an old file. It was a stranger's storage shed, sold at auction after his death, and a box that should have been thrown away years earlier. Millbrook Falls is the kind of town that grew up around a paper mill and never quite let go of the identity that mill gave it, even after the mill itself closed in the early 1980s. By 1996, the town had a little under 3,000 people, a main street with a hardware store, and a diner and a church with a bell tower you could hear from nearly anywhere in town, and a harvest fair every October that was, without exaggeration, the biggest event of the year. Families put up handmade banners that had been reused for a decade. The volunteer fire department ran a dunk tank the same way it had every year since the mill closed, one of the few traditions the town had managed to keep. Kids traded stickers and ran between booths while their parents caught up with neighbors they hadn't seen since the spring thaw. Someone's boombox played whatever was on the radio that fall, and a payphone by the entrance had a line of kids waiting to call home for quarters they'd usually lose in the grass instead. The air that day smelled like kettle corn and wood smoke, and the sound that carried over everything was the church bell marking each hour, the same bell that would ring, unknowingly, through the exact hour that Katie disappeared. Katie Sorensen was 8 years old, the younger of 2 daughters, the kind of kid who narrated her own life out loud without being self-conscious about it, describing what she was doing as she did it, as though the world needed the commentary to be real. She collected rocks she thought looked unusual and kept them in an old cigar box under her bed, sorted by color. 40-some rocks she could each explain the origin of if you asked. She had just started learning to ride a bike without training wheels that summer and was fiercely proud of it, riding wobbly circles in the driveway until dusk most evenings. Her mother, Diane, was a nurse at the county hospital, and her father, Tom, worked what was left of the old mill's maintenance contracts, patching machinery that mostly sat unused now. That Saturday, Katie had been begging all week to go to the fair for the balloon vendor alone, a man who twisted animal shapes out of long balloons, and Diane had finally agreed, walking her over hand in hand while her older sister, Meg, stayed home with a cold. Diane remembers letting go of Katie's hand for what she thought would be a moment, turning to answer a question from a neighbor about a bake sale contribution, and that the balloon vendor's line had barely moved by the time she turned back around. At 2:47 p.m., Diane Sorensen last saw her daughter standing at the edge of the balloon line. At 2:51, she turned back to check on her, and Katie was not there. At 2:58, after a frantic sweep of the immediate fairground, Diane alerted a police officer working fair security. By 3:20, every officer in Millbrook Falls and 2 neighboring towns had been called in, and the fair itself was shut down mid-afternoon. Hundreds of attendees held at the gate, while officers checked bags, cars, and booths. At 4:40, nearly 2 hours after Katie vanished, a volunteer found a single small sneaker in the tall grass at the edge of the fairground parking field. Laces still neatly tied, as though it had simply come off rather than been pulled off in a struggle. No sign of Katie herself. No witness who remembered seeing her leave with anyone. In a fairground of hundreds of people who all knew each other, nobody could say who the small girl by the balloon line had walked away with. The search that followed was, by any measure, enormous. The National Guard was brought in within 48 hours. Search dogs worked the tree line behind the fairground for a week, and volunteer crews walked the riverbank downstream from the falls the town was named for, twice, in case Katie had wandered rather than been taken. Every registered vehicle that had been parked at the fair that day was tracked down and its owner interviewed, a process that took investigators the better part of 2 months and produced a filing cabinet's worth of alibis. Most of them mundane, none of them useful. Detective Ray Kowalczyk, the lead investigator on the case and a father himself, worked the file harder than any case in his career, sleeping some nights at his desk rather than going home, reviewing witness statements so many times that colleagues remember him reciting them from memory during briefings. He pursued 3 named suspects over the following year: a mill worker with a prior trespassing charge, cleared through a solid alibi placing him 40 miles away, Katie's estranged uncle, who had a contentious relationship with the family, but was 600 miles away that weekend, confirmed by hotel records and a gas station receipt. And an unidentified man in a green jacket that 2 fairgoers separately remembered near the balloon line, a man no one could name and no composite sketch ever fully captured, despite 3 separate attempts over the following decade. The town's own theory, whispered but never proven, was that whoever took Katie had to have been someone the fair simply absorbed without noticing. Not a stranger who stood out, but someone who blended into the crowd the way anyone local would. That theory haunted the investigation for years, because it meant the answer might have been standing in that crowd the whole time, unremarkable, unnoticed, gone home afterward like everyone else. Diane Sorensen kept every flyer, every tip line printout, every dead-end lead in a filing cabinet she never let anyone else touch, updating it herself long after the department's active involvement slowed. The department's official file grew to over 4,000 pages within 5 years and answered nothing. 5 years passed with no trace of Katie beyond that single sneaker. 10 years passed, and the fair itself nearly stopped being held at all before the town decided, painfully, that canceling it permanently would be its own kind of loss, a second thing taken from Katie rather than a tribute to her. 15 years in, Diane Sorensen was still driving past the fairground every October, unable to attend, but unable to stay entirely away either, parking across the street for exactly as long as she could stand it before driving home. Tom Sorensen passed away in 2009, 13 years after Katie vanished, without ever learning what happened to his daughter, a fact Diane has said in the rare interviews she's given that she considers one of the cruelest parts of the entire ordeal, that he carried the not knowing all the way to his own death. Katie's older sister, Meg, grew up largely defined by an absence she barely remembered clearly. Raised in a house where her parents flinched at every unexpected knock on the door, where every birthday had an empty chair nobody ever filled with a new setting. By the case's 20th anniversary, the department had reassigned the file twice more, and each new detective inherited 4,000 pages of dead ends alongside Diane's own increasingly worn copies of the same documents. She had, by then, memorized the green jacket witness statements well enough to recite them, still hoping someone, somewhere, would recognize a detail the original investigators had missed. 20 years is a long time to keep hoping, without any new information to hope with, And Millbrook Falls spent every one of those years doing exactly that. If a story like this one is why you keep coming back to this channel, take a second to like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Now, back to Millbrook Falls. The case might have stayed exactly where it was if a man named Arnold Petrie hadn't died alone in a rented house on the edge of town this past winter, with no next of kin willing to claim his belongings. Petrie had moved to Millbrook Falls in 1995, a year before Katie disappeared, working odd handyman jobs around town and keeping mostly to himself, though neighbors remembered him as polite, always ready with a wave. A man who fixed a fence or a gutter for cash and never asked for much beyond that. He had, by every account, simply been part of the town's background for nearly 30 years, unremarkable in exactly the way the old theory had feared. He paid his rent on time. He kept his yard neat. He was the kind of neighbor nobody thought to mention to anyone, because there was nothing about him that seemed worth mentioning. When Petrie died with no will and no family to notify, the county auctioned off the contents of his rented storage shed to cover unpaid fees, as is standard procedure for unclaimed property. A local antiques dealer named Carol Fenn bought the contents sight unseen, mostly for the tools. A box of old hand drills and a table saw she figured she could resell easily. It was 3 weeks before she got around to going through a locked metal box she'd assumed held old paperwork. Tucked behind a stack of paint cans she nearly hadn't bothered to move. Instead, she found a child's sneaker, matching in every visible detail the twin of the one found at the fairground in 1996, along with a handful of photographs and a torn fairground admission ticket dated the exact weekend Katie disappeared. Carol Fenn did not touch anything further. She set the box down exactly where she'd found it, backed out of the shed, and called the Millbrook Falls Police Department that same afternoon. Her hands, she later said, shaking too hard to dial on the first attempt. She sat on her porch step until an officer arrived, unwilling to go back inside the shed alone. Detective Paul Anzalone had been a rookie patrol officer in 1996, one of the many who'd walked the tree line behind the fairground that October without finding anything. He was the one who drove out to Carol Fenn's shop that evening, and he has said publicly that he recognized the sneaker before she'd even finished explaining what she'd found. The items were sent for forensic testing immediately. The sneaker's manufacturing details, sole wear pattern, and a faint identifying mark Diane Sorensen had put on the inside of both of Katie's shoes as a child. A habit so small that even Detective Kowalczyk's original file had never recorded it, because Diane had never thought to mention something so minor. Matched. Exactly. The forensic genealogy process that ultimately confirmed the connection works by comparing degraded DNA recovered from old evidence against modern genetic databases, the same technology now used to identify decades-old remains, tracing a match through distant relatives when no direct sample exists. A partial DNA profile recovered from the box, run against that same technology, returned a familial match to a niece of Arnold Petrie's who had never known he existed until investigators contacted her. For 28 years, Arnold Petrie had lived in Millbrook Falls as exactly what the town's worst fear had always described. Not a stranger who stood out, but a face so unremarkable it never drew a second look. He waved at neighbors from his porch every morning. He fixed fences for cash and refused to overcharge, which people remembered as a point in his favor. He attended the very same harvest fair in later years without anyone thinking twice about his presence there, buying kettle corn and standing near the same booths where Katie once stood. In hindsight, 2 longtime residents recalled that Petrie had abruptly stopped attending the fair himself sometime around 1997, a single year after Katie's disappearance, and never once mentioned it in the following decades, even when it came up in ordinary conversation at the hardware store or the diner. a silence that seemed at the time like simple disinterest, rather than what it may actually have been. One neighbor recalled, only after the story broke, that Petrie had once abruptly ended a conversation the moment Katie's name came up during a town meeting about renewing the fair's permit, excusing himself to his truck without explanation. Because Petrie died before any of this came to light, there was no arrest in the traditional sense, no trial, no verdict read aloud in a courtroom. The county attorney's office reviewed the physical evidence, the Dina match, and Petrie's own unexplained possession of Katie's belongings, and issued a formal statement naming him as responsible for her disappearance, closing the case as solved. The community's reaction, when the story broke this year, moved in stages familiar to anyone who has watched a town absorb this kind of news. First, disbelief that a name so unfamiliar could be the answer to something so enormous, then a colder unease at realizing he had lived among them, unnoticed, for nearly 3 decades, attending the same fair, waving at the same neighbors, all the while holding the answer no one else had. Longtime residents have since described an unsettled quiet that settled over Main Street in the weeks after the news broke. A sense that the town's own read of a familiar face could no longer be trusted the way it once had been. Diane Sorensen, now in her 70s, was given the sneaker and the recovered items and asked whether she wanted anything made public beyond the department's statement. She said only that 28 years of not knowing had taught her that some questions cannot be undone once they're answered, only carried differently, and that she intended to bury what remained of her daughter beside her father at last, together, the way she'd always imagined they'd eventually be. Katie Sorensen, at her best, was a girl who narrated her own life out loud without embarrassment, who sorted unusual rocks by color in a cigar box under her bed, who had just learned to ride a bike and was prouder of that than of almost anything else in her short life. She was, by everyone's account, exactly the kind of ordinary, unguarded child a small town assumes it can keep safe simply by knowing everyone in it. What Millbrook Falls lost that October afternoon wasn't only a child. It was the town's own belief that it could recognize danger when it stood in the crowd beside them, and 28 years later, that belief has still not fully returned. The Harvest Fair added a formal check-in system for children under 12 the following year, a policy still in place today, one of the few concrete things anyone can point to and say, this, at least, came from what happened to Katie. Meg Sorensen, now an adult with children of her own, has said she plans to tell her own kids about the aunt they never met once they're old enough to understand, so that Katie remains something more than the case file the town spent nearly 3 decades trying to close. What does it mean that the man responsible for Katie's disappearance lived among the very people searching for her for nearly 3 decades without ever once being suspected? Does knowing the answer so many years later actually bring the peace it seems to promise? Or does it only change the shape of what a family carries? And how many other small towns are, right now, unknowingly sharing a fairground, a main street, a wave hello, with someone who is not what he appears to be? Justice found Katie Sorensen after 28 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe, and more cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.